Today on our podcast, we probably have one of the most well-known people in the retail, research, investment communities joining our podcast, Deborah Weinswig. She's CEO and founder of CoreSight Research, which, by the way, if you don't know, it's a research, data, events advisory firm that focuses on the intersection of retail and technology. Deborah also serves on many boards and is involved in many philanthropic organizations. And here's her fun fact. Deborah, you're also a certified public accountant.
I am. I got to tell you, that is I talked to somebody yesterday and I've never quite had that reception to saying I was a CPA. They're like, you were a CPA? They're like, and this is something I really respect. They're like, that's amazing. And I'm like, I said, it was honestly of any background you could have, right, to be doing what I'm doing now, because not only was it, and I worked in public accounting, so, one of the big six at the time, big four now at PwC. And so not only did you, well, first of all, you were working with incredibly senior people, right? I mean, you're literally, and as a young person, you're like, I just don't understand why the CFO of this public company isn't getting me this tomorrow. And, because you just didn't understand. And you had a deadline you had to stay on. And if somebody didn't tell you, and so you really learn to work with like a large group of people, you learn to really like balance your time. And, you became an expert, not only in kind of, basically accounting regulations, but also you'll love this. They called it the garbage team because like literally and I kid you not, I'm not making up what I'm about to say. I literally would be auditing Playboy one day and Alumax was at the time like the third largest aluminum manufacturer in the world. And Wilson Sporting Goods and like literally everything in between. And so you learn so much about so many different industries and you had to go really narrow and deep. And so with what I do now with research, it's been like the best background.
Oh, that's amazing. I really dislike accounting. I'm just going to be completely transparent here. I did horrible in school. I can do retail math like crazy, financial analysis like crazy, accounting, just couldn't get through it. So I admire that quality about you.
I have to tell you one more thing. So when I was at PwC, I had there were like two of us in this program where we spent 6 months in audit and 6 months in tax. And I was like, I want to learn as much as I can. So it was fascinating. When I was doing tax, I would actually dream. You cannot make this up. I would dream, like if there was something that wasn't footing, which of course happened all the time, you would like literally in the middle of the night, I'm like, oh, I figured it out. And I'd wake up and I'd like have a notepad next to my bed. And I was like, okay, this is like, I've got to like, I am like way too into this. I have got to like, kind of get to the other side. But it is interesting how one's brain does work if one has an accounting brain.
That's so interesting. Well, hey, listen, Deborah, I used to think I was like super productive, until I met you. And I think I met you like a decade ago. You are so prolific in your contributions to the industry. They're so broad, they're so deep, not to mention all the philanthropic work that you do. It's just amazing. So we could actually spend our entire podcast just talking about all of your many contributions and accolades and awards and research. You're literally on the top of every influencer, analyst, investor, pundit list in our industry. But let's start our interview by asking you to share your journey from kind of research or even being a CPA or being an investment analyst to really starting your own company, CoreSight Research.
Well, it's very funny that, the topic for today. So our associate director of research had asked me, we had an intern class, and she's like, can you come in and just, do this kind of introduction of yourself and CoreSight? And I was like, gosh, I really hadn't prepared for it, but I don't want to let people down. And so literally she kicked it off and I don't think I took a breath. And it was like 30 minutes later and she's like, well, thanks, that's it for today. I'm like, but I didn't even get started, right? I was like, so it's
true.
It's when you're passionate about something. I mean, I think that goes, and Shelley, you've always been so passionate about what you've done as well. And I think to me, when you're passionate, it doesn't feel like work, right? There's a joy about it. Now, of course, I would say there ends up being some of the administrative stuff and whatnot. But I also think if you don't let that kind of pile up, if you just kind of plow through it right away, then it doesn't build up and kind of feel like this kryptonite that's, weighing on you. So if I were to kind of go way back, I'm going to go back to when I was in 6th grade. I was certain I wanted to be a doctor. I loved everything about science. I always asked the question why. I wanted to, going back to, I wanted to do something, I wanted to do something that had an impact on the world. And I wanted to do something good. That's what I always said. And
That's
so
great.
sixth grade, I was like, I knew it when I took a lot of, when I went to high school. Herein lies the reason that I discovered later that I should have that doctor, hood was not in my cards. So freshman year, I take honors science, then I take chem, then I take
Ooh.
advanced chem and AP chem, and then I'm taking physics. But what you realize is there's no biology in there.
Oh,
So I literally went through all of high school with no biology, and I had been a very devout vegan. So I had, kind of just, not only kind of in terms of I never spent my time like seeing dead animals, and I didn't spend my time eating anything that was animal driven at
right.
the time. So I had this amazing opportunity. I got into Indiana University into basically an honors chemistry program. There are only 40 of us. And right, everybody was on like the fast track to med school. And so I love the chemistry. I mean, it was just beyond anything. I had a great lab partner. I mean, that was great. That was first semester. Second semester, you're taking like honors biology. So everything's accelerated. And I mean, I remember I actually like, I did not, I mean, I was just like woozy, right? Like it was even with like the bugs. I mean, I was like, I can't, I mean, there's like a dead bug here that I know didn't need, right? So it's not like a dead bug that was outside of the lab that like, had already, expired, right? This bug was deemed dead so I could look at it. And I just like at the time, like my moral conviction was so at odds with what we were doing.
Interesting.
It was like physical for me though. And so I spent a semester and I ended up, I realized doctorate was not for me. So I took sociology, psychology, philosophy, and art history. And I kid you not, because you cannot make this up. I'm like, I want to be an accountant. Because
No
what I
way.
loved is, well, I didn't really know about finance, right? I knew about
Yeah,
accounting because I was
of
like, I
course.
realized I love numbers, right?
Yeah.
I, and for me, like, I love the labs, right? Because I could almost see, right? I knew where I, I could understand what the outcome was supposed to be. And then I knew kind of along the way if our numbers were or were not working. And so you were like, I'd be like mid lab and I'm like, something's wrong with our experiment. So like this is like my lab partner living, like we would go back to the beginning and figure out, right, what were we doing wrong? So we never had to repeat labs. We were able to kind of like adjust it in real time.
Wow.
And so to me, I'm like, oh, accounting, that's as close to numbers as I could get. Well, going from honors chemistry, at least for my brain, to accounting, I was like, I have so much time, right? Like, what am I going to do with all my extra time? So I took on like a part-time job and like all
Oh
steak
my
and
God.
shake. I mean, stuff that you can't make up. But I loved it. I had an internship. I cannot tell you how much I was like, this is for me. I love working. I mean, for those of you who know me, I am not shy. You're working in a room with 20 people, and all you do, for any of you who've been in accounting or others, like all you do is right, you're working, but you're talking with everybody in the room, right? Your brain literally is doing the work in front of you. And sometimes you're having a social conversation about the client, about work, or about things that have nothing to do with kind of what's in front of you. And graduated, went on to work at PwC and had this kind of very kind of diverse background in terms of what I covered. And in about the first year, I was like, okay, right, like I've mastered this. Now what? And that was, I think, at the point I realized that there needed to be kind of another career for me because I got promoted incredibly early, right? I spent half my year in audit and tax, and I still got promoted in half the amount of time that somebody normally does, even with all of those. So I'd only spent a year actually in audit, and I got promoted to be a senior, which was way too early. And so then I'm spending all my time in like the regulations, which I
Oh
did not view
gosh.
as fun as I like the client work and I like sitting in the room with everybody and right like and so because the regulation stuff was almost like being a lawyer. And so I was like, I don't think this is for me. So I was like, business school. That's gonna get me from here to there. And so I applied for business school. I got into University of Chicago. I got a scholarship because
Nice.
yeah, so even I grew up in a home, my parents were very philanthropic. And when I was at PwC, I volunteered for junior achievement. And I was living in Chicago at the time. And you can't make this up. The very first day I was with this teacher, she said to me, I know I have a good class this year because nobody has told me to F off. And I'm like, okay, I am in a whole new, but I will tell you, I realized like I loved, without knowing it, I love the stock market. And so what I did is I had each student, whether it was where their parents worked or a brand that they loved, pick a stock. I taught them, mind you, I don't even know how I knew how to do this myself, but we basically, kind of used the Wall Street Journal to track stock prices. And I had them, we came in once a week. I had them kind of follow this company and tell us something new each week. And what I did on the first day, I had them fill out, right, what they wanted to do, other things that were, kind of interesting about them, right? Like, what were their hobbies? Did they like any sports? And it was amazing in 16 weeks what that card was on day one and what that card was on the last day. Because literally some of them were like, I want to be a fireman. I want to be a professional baseball
Wow.
player. And by the end, it was a completely different. And I was like, you know what? I loved it. First of all, it was only 16 weeks and you could see the impact you had. But I was like, I love this ability to kind of talk to people through stocks and through telling
That's a
stories. And so I
great
was like,
project.
and so when I went to business school, I was like, I want to do something with, kind of the markets and stocks and telling stories, and found I was literally an N of one. I was the only person in my graduating class at University of Chicago who went on to equity research because at the time nobody even really, I mean, right, these departments were fairly small in the banks. Most people were going into banking and they didn't even recruit, right? It was either like iBanking or sales and trading. And I spent my summer internship at Bear Stearns.
Ooh.
And yeah, and so at University of Chicago, we were on the quarter system.
Uh-huh.
So we ended late, but then we went back late. And so they let me, I asked, I said, when the new training class comes in, can I join them and whatnot? And I will tell you, it was an experience like no others. I was on the risk arb desk. I spent time in capital markets. I spent times in convert. Oh, Shelly, this is the best. So my mentor was on the converts desk. And he asked me, he's like, can you look in the, this convert baby superstores? I'm like, sure. So I start researching, and I'm not going to give away any dates because that's not what we do at this point in our lives.
No.
But not many people were using the internet then. And we were all on dial-ups too. So I mean, for those of you who know me, I don't sleep that much, never have. And so I pull an all-nighter, like I just don't leave the office. I don't think anyone noticed I was wearing the same clothes the next day because it was like a blue suit, skirt suit. And so I hand him a 27-page report on baby superstores. And he's like, where did you get this? And I'm like, I wrote it. He's like, but how did you write it? I said, I researched it. He's like, what does that even mean? He's like, how would you research it? I'm like, I went onto the internet. Now, man, why don't you, Shelley? Or some other, at that point, nobody was blocking websites. So let's just say, as a fairly naive person, there was also like sex superstores, and I had like an education like no other to this research project. But I'll leave that in the past in the past. And he was just like, and so literally like I sat down with him, like not when the markets were open, but I think, after 4 o'clock. And I showed him how I did. And he's like, this is just incredible. And he's like, he's like, have you thought about research? And I was like, I've been thinking, I mean, I said, I'm thinking about a lot of things. I said, I really enjoyed it. I love the risk arb desk. And so I ended up spending the last 6 weeks of my internship in research.
Wow.
I was with Dana Telsey. I wrote a 97-page
Oh, yeah.
report. She let me put my name on the cover. I mean, who else had that coming out of their summer internship?
That's
And
unbelievable.
but I knew at the end what was so incredible about how Bear had put this, well, it was kind of self-driven internship, if you will, but there was a formal program around it that I knew for sure this is what I wanted to do. And to have that level of conviction going into my second year of business school was unbelievable. And then, hey, to have as your kind of calling card a 97-page report you wrote with your name on it, that set me up, I'd say better than if I had an internship in, let's say, another field. And so I will tell you, I only interviewed for equity research. I had a wealth of opportunities. I was very grateful to, and I will tell you, some of the people I met during the recruiting process, I've like run into later in my
Oh,
life.
that's
I was just,
great.
and you're like, do you remember this? And do you remember that? And I mean, it's unbelievable. And so I ended up
I'm sure
going,
they're saying to themselves, how did we lose her? How did we lose her? How did she not come here?
well, and it's funny because, so I ended up, and I remember, I will say this about Dana because she was amazing. I was like, because I had an offer from Bear and I said, I'm just going to accept it. And she's like, Deborah, that's not the best thing for you. She's like, I would love for you to be here. She's like, but you need to go out. And I mean, what mentor ever says this? Well, maybe a mentor does, but a boss doesn't.
Right.
So she said, you should go out and see what else is out there. And right, if you come back to us, then this is right. But she's like, you really need to go look and see what the other banks are like and whatnot. So I ended up going to Morgan Stanley. I did not return to Bear Stearns immediately. And what was so interesting there is I was always very interested in like I'd say the global landscape. And the role I ended up taking was, even though I was hired as an analyst, I ended up on the strategy team, which was unbelievable. And I worked on this product. It was actually the first of its kind. It was called the Competitive Edge. And it was like, it was kind of research driven stock
Oh,
portfolio, but we actually turned it into a product at Morgan Stanley Investment Management. So
great.
it was, and it was global. So I got to go meet everybody, right? You're going down to LATAM and you're flying to Japan and you're flying to China. I mean, and going back to like my kind of my role at PwC, I got to be an expert in a lot of different industries. I mean, I covered
That's amazing.
Asia Pulp and Paper, AMD, right? I mean, you got to learn BMW, right? Like, so you had to become an expert in autos, in chips, in all these things because you only own 40 stocks in this portfolio. I mean, you had to know not only the company and the management, but you needed to know the sector because, and like I was, I lived in fear. And by the way, I don't know if you knew people who worked at Morgan Stanley at the time, we would all sleep under our desks. Like we
Well, that was
literally,
required, right? I mean, that
yes.
was kind of like the unwritten rule.
Well, it was like, but you were trying to squeeze more hours out of the day. So you're like, okay, it's 30 minutes to get home. It's 30 minutes to get back. We have a gym. I can just run up there for a quick shower. And I can like, you'd order your dinner at night and put it in the little fridge in your office and you'd eat it for breakfast the next day, right? I mean, that was like the time. And I loved everything about it.
Wow.
And if you go back in time, right, at Morgan Stanley, at the time we had Barton Biggs, who I was very, very close to. He's not with us anymore. Byron Ween, Peter Canello, and Leah Modigliani. And we would get on Monday mornings, we would have this. These are the things when you go back in your life and you think about it, right? What had an impact on you or what you really loved, because it's like emotional.
Of course.
And we would have breakfast, right? We'd have like, our croissants and our bagels and our fruit and coffee, and we would all talk. I love these memories I have of this meeting every Monday. We would talk about what we were going to say right when we got up on the dais, right? We had 5 minutes or whatever, 7 maybe sometimes. Scott Slayton ran a very tough and tight like morning call. Very good. Started candidate, right? And so we would be up there and I'd see it 3 out of 4 weeks or 3 out of 5 weeks,
Wow.
depending on the month. And so Barton would be like, this is what I'm going to talk about. So Byron would always go first because Byron was just US and like Barton was global. And I'd say 9 times out of 10, Barton would talk about something completely different and make Byron look like an oaf. And I'm like, either this is, and like they had this whole fire and ice thing. I'm like, either Byron knows, but I was like, how can he possibly know? Because they just agreed to talk about this other thing. And, and our salespeople loved it, right? Because
Oh,
they
that's so
could
funny.
see this like, drama. And so I really enjoyed the very kind of macro side of things, but also going back to kind of my experience through junior achievement, I really knew I had a passion for stocks as well. And so I was offered 3 sectors at Morgan Stanley. And I don't know what you think about this, Shelley, but their belief was that people would, right back then, people would stay in their, at the companies for a long time, that in 10 years, you should have 3 different roles. And so so after kind of, 2.5 years when I expressed an interest to, kind of go back to like what I thought my calling was as an analyst, they really did try to accommodate that. So they offered me, we're talking as unsexy as it gets in terms of sectors. And I got offered cement,
Oh my
can
gosh.
not make this up, packaging, and specialty chemicals.
Oh gosh.
And I'm like, nah. It was like, and I don't know if you're this way, but like sometimes you're like, I'm gonna go to sleep and I'm gonna see, well, I mean, and hey, maybe like the, kind of the tax form fills itself out in your head, or you have this epiphany.
Yeah.
And I'm like, let me wake up in the morning and see how I feel. I'm like, no, I mean, it's just not there.
Hmm.
And it was a really hard decision because I love Morgan Stanley. I loved everything about it. They were very philanthropic. I got very involved in student sponsor partnership through them. And they will say, and I worked directly with the head of global research with Mary Clark. And then at the time, our head of US research was Dennis Shea. And so I reached back out to Dana and I
Oh
was
my
like,
gosh.
yep. And so I was like, I know I loved working there on stocks with you. And so what I didn't realize was exactly how my journey was going to go there because now, right, I'd spent 2.5 years as a strategist. So, right, and this was back before there was kind of, this is when banking and research worked more closely together. And the bankers were like, right, what does she know? So going back to like how, for me personally, philanthropy and my professional life are so interwoven. So I'm like, I'm just not going to get this job. I can feel it. And so I sit down with this guy, Andy Bugis. He's like the head of banking at the time. And I'm just not connecting, right? Like you can just feel
Yeah.
there's something like we're not. And I look over, I can't make this up. And there was like a student sponsored partnership mug.
Oh my
And
gosh.
I'm like, you're involved in SSP? And he's like, yeah, I kid you not. We talked for like an hour and a half nonstop about student sponsor partnership. And as amazing of the work that Morgan Stanley did. So for those of you who don't know, Bear Stearns, when the street lost Bear, they didn't just lose, right, a bank. They also lost a huge contribution to philanthropy because as
Right.
senior managing directors, and I believe managing directors as well, you were required to give 4% of your pre-tax income to charitable causes. And you had to like literally hand in your, they weren't just like, oh, this is a nice thing to do. You actually had to hand in your tax returns so that they could validate that you had upheld that. And so what you would
Interesting.
do was amazing. You would send, yeah, so I obviously ended up going to work there. So you would send a little, like a flyer with a kind of letter attached on why this organization was important to you. And people would give, right? And it was unbelievable. And so Andy had all of these stories about how different, very senior people, I mean, literally people had adopted children. I mean, I'm telling you what people there had done for this, organization, which was basically taking children who are at risk.
Yeah.
And because the Catholic schools were affordable, we would take children and we would, kind of match them with a Catholic school also in their neighborhood so they didn't have to travel.
That's
And
great.
we would provide mentorship. And so that was like my checkbox at Bear Stearns. And, I joined a few weeks later.
Well, let me ask you a question. So, correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't come from banking and I don't come from equity research. But at that time, were there a lot, besides Dana, were there a lot of like women in that field? How was it being a female in what I would consider to be, I think, a very male dominated, both industries are kind of male dominated at that time?
Shelley, it was interesting when you asked me to do this podcast, I really took a giant step back and thought about in my life how I've been very fortunate. I've had very strong women as mentors literally every step of the way. So during my summer internship, or excuse me, during my internship at PwC, which was during busy season, so second semester of my junior year, there was a woman at the time, her name was Ada Rodriguez. She got married, became Ada Majuno,
Oh,
and she had been a very important mentor to me. And then there was a woman when I went back full time, and her name was Deanna Harnett. She was also a triathlete, which I eventually became. And so she was really kind of my mentor. And if you go right in my summer, I had Dana. And then when I was at Morgan Stanley, my boss, Mary Clark, was a very strong woman. And I remember Mary, I love you, but she's about my size. Shelly and I are about the same size, right?
yeah, yeah.
We're kind of on the very petite
Petite.
side. And so she would walk in a room and like fear. I mean, there's like palpable fear because she was so smart. I mean, I've never met anybody, I mean, who could cut through so much so quickly and just truly like an icon. And then I went to work with Dana at Bear. And if you think about it, right, I've always had women as mentors. And maybe in some ways, I don't know. Like I said, Shelly, to prepare for this day, I really thought about it, right? Were they more comfortable being very direct with me? I don't know. But if I were to kind of take this over to going to Citigroup, it may be helpful in terms of the context of this because I stayed at Bear for 2 years. I was recruited by Citi, which, I mean, first of all, we had all of at the time, the brokers, right? We had Smith Barney. So you just had this platform. I mean, you could move stocks. I mean, it was amazing. And I was definitely way over my head. I mean, just the sheer size of the bank, right? Because Morgan Stanley at the time, Morgan Stanley has Smith Barney, but at the time, right, it was just we didn't have that breadth. Bear didn't either. And so you're going into this like juggernaut. And I felt a little lost and, well, I was definitely lost. And so I remember I initiated coverage and I had these two women, Ellen and Jody, who came to me and said, we need to have a conversation. I'm like, okay, right? Like, and they were super direct. They're like, you can't be like all over the place. You have to have 3 key points. We're hearing from 20 analysts a day that all have great content. You have to stand out. And they said, we're going to meet like once a week.
Wow.
And I was like, we are? I'm like,
That's
okay,
amazing.
right, let's do this. Like homework. I love homework, right? Like going back to my audit program. I'm like, okay, and so I will tell you, they really took me under their wing and they really worked very hard because it was really different from anything I'd experienced. But I've had strong women and those who also really gave of their time and energy freely that I think made a major impact on my career. Because if they hadn't come up to me, I don't know how I would have done. Hopefully somebody else would have, or, before I completely, flunked out. But I was, like I said, when they hire you at a senior level, they just assume you can do it. But this is such a different platform than anyone. So
that's great.
It's interesting, Shelley, when you start to think about those who've made an impact on your career and what the threat is. I mean, for me, it really was this strong group of women.
That's amazing. Let me switch gears for a second because earlier I talked about your high level of productivity and everything you do, and you're balancing running your own company, being on all these boards, doing this community service, and of course you have your personal life too. Like, how do you balance everything? How do you prioritize? And do you have any like strategies you can share with us about how do you maintain well-being and avoid burnout?
So number one, I would say in terms of first of all, and I say this to employees, like health, it always comes first. Because if you don't have your health, you don't have anything. So you have to take care. And for right, we're all very unique. So for everyone, that is something very different. I think that's, as a leader, that's something, right? Some people, we've got people on our team who in like what they can do in 5 hours, I can't do in 15, right? They're just kind of that level of productive, right? As people who know me, I like to boil the ocean. I really like to think about everything. And it's just, sure, I probably could get it done in 5, but it's not, I wouldn't enjoy my job as much. And so I think health first, family second. Because if you don't have your health, then you can't be there for your family. And then I think work is third. And I think when you have tough decisions to make, if you always put them in that order, I'm going to be open with you. There was a doctor's appointment I was asked to cancel I still remember it, almost a year ago for a client meeting. And I still think about that sometimes because I'm like, we should never make anyone in our organization do that because it then took me like 6 months to reschedule it. But we have to kind of practice what we preach. I was asked to do it. Other people in the organization were like, this is a really important client. Okay, but those are the things we can't, because like I still think about it. I'm like, here I am telling people this is how they should do things, and I sacrifice this myself. So I think it goes back to if you use that order always when you're trying to make decisions, it does make it really easy. And sometimes, there's been conferences I've been at, and I'm there, but I have to leave a day early to attend to something for my children's school or, kind of in my larger family, extended family. And so that I think is when you have that kind of, priority set, it's helpful. And then going back to what I said earlier on, there's and I think I felt like, I don't know about you, I felt like I piled up all this admin stuff during the pandemic because just the ways that we had done things in the past, right? We
Yeah.
were like looking around and it was all just us. And since you weren't talking to people, you couldn't kind of like get things off your plate as easily, and it became very formal. Like I had somebody who reached out to me a few days ago, and they're like, "Oh, should we? I'll send a Teams." I said, "No." I said, "I will pick up the phone and call you the minute, like, you know what I mean? It's like actually it's after this." I'm like, "No, no more." Like, I'm like, I think that going back to just thinking about how we're spending our time, and then I work out almost every day, and so
Yay.
I
Good for you.
I and I'll go through periods where it's it's different. So I'll tell you, and I did post something on LinkedIn about this about 2 months ago now. I ended up staying in the city. My son is actually going to senior in high school, and so he's got a lot of stress on him studying for the SATs and college and all this. And so I'm like, it probably just makes sense for us to stay in the city in the weekend and really kind of like drill down. So like husband, rest of the family all went out to the beach or whatever, and so we stayed there. So I fell asleep right there, like 10 p.m. on Saturday night. I do, and I also too, I try not to do any work at all on Saturday. So that's also like my absolutely, I may think about it, but I really try not to actually do anything, like even, and so, I'd had a fairly at least, kind of relaxing day. So I fell asleep at like 10 o'clock on Saturday night. I wake up. I don't require a lot of sleep. I woke up at like 6 a.m. on Sunday morning. I'm like, what do people do at 6 a.m. on Sunday morning? I'm like, well, I'm like, I used to go to, I used to run races and stuff like that. I was a, competitive athlete. I'm like, let me look on like my gym app and see what's going on. Like maybe there's some kind of race or something. I don't know what I was thinking. And I'm like, oh, there's classes. I'd actually never been to a class before. I know I am like some things you discover later in life. I'm okay being a late bloomer. And so I looked, I'm like, remember Equinox, I'm like, oh my gosh, look at all these classes. And they're all like a 10-minute walk. And so I went to a Tabata Max class,
Oh my
and
gosh.
not only did I talk to the instructor afterwards, and I said to her, I said, I just want you to know this is my first class. She's like, oh, the first class you've taken with me. I'm like, no, I said my first class. She's like, your first class at this location. I'm like, no, my first class ever. She's like, this is amazing. And so she's like,
Oh,
and what she did is she's like, tomorrow I'm teaching at this time at this location. The next day I'm teaching here at this location. And she set out this like path for me. And so if I have been in the city, or even I was in Toronto and I'm on the board of Primaris, where the company's based there, I have been to an Equinox to take a class. Because I mean, when you think about it, like I'm the kind I do sleep in my workout clothes often because it's one less thing to do in the morning. But if you're already waking up and you're in your workout clothes, right? And you have a time that you're supposed to be somewhere, right? You show up. There's not that much motivation that you need to get from here to there. And I think, Shelly, because at least for me, a lot of the admin stuff I find is like, that's where I need to motivate because I'm like, it's sometimes a lot that you have to get through, but you need to do that to get
yes.
to the other side. So I actually reserve a lot of my energy for some of the more kind of task oriented stuff.
Interesting.
And if I can keep that like motivational juice in the fridge ready to go, that's kind of how I think about it. So I really do take, and for those of you who don't know, I have celiac, unfortunately, or fortunately. So I've always had to be really, really careful with what I eat. I was diagnosed in 20,
Oh,
and they thought I had a brain tumor. So I had a lot of CAT scans done. And I ended up having, I won't use his name because I'm not sure if he would want me to, but I had an executive who I was doing a non-deal roadshow with of a retailer. And we at that time you didn't really talk much about yourself. And he's like, we just spent 3 days together though in Europe marketing, and like I felt a little bit more, open and comfortable. And so he's like, how are you? And I'm like, I'm not good. I'm like, I'm really not. I'm like, it feels like somebody is like literally taking a baseball bat through the back of my head. And it felt like literally like through my eyes. They're like putting like a baseball bat through like the eye socket. And so he's like, I think you should go to Mayo. He's like, I'll help you, kind of introduce you to the right people. So I went, right? Like pee in a cup, blood test. That day I had a diagnosis. So they see, so this is 2010, right? This was not that
Wow.
talked about, nothing. Wait. So literally they sit me down. They're like, you have celiac disease. Disease in any sentence is not good. And so I'm just sitting there, right? Like, kind of head held low. And I said, well, what does that mean? And they're like, well, you can't eat barley, wheat, or rye. And I'm like, and what else? They're like, that's pretty, I mean, there are other things, but that's pretty much it. And I'm like, so if I don't eat barley, wheat, or rye, I'm going to feel much better. And they're like, pretty much. So they had me sit down with the nutritionist, right, the rest of my time there to help me manage. And, she went through all this. I mean, and hey, there are things that like I learned later on. Licorice, I mean, the things that you never think, licorice has gluten in it, right? And some of these things now they have gluten-free, but there were things you discover along the way. And I will tell you, in 48 hours, I was a new person.
Wow, that's amazing.
And I will tell you, it goes back to as well, and it goes back to what I've always put my health on, at the top of my list. But it goes back to just kind of keep at it because, if you feel off, right, there is probably something there. It's not in your head, no matter how many doctors tell. Well, truly in my
That's
head.
right.
No matter how many doctors tell you that. And so I've had to be very, very careful with what I eat. And I will tell you, for me, though, as an endurance athlete, I was a triathlete at the time. It was harder to fuel for races if you're not, so that I will say that was for me, that was what kind of fell out of, for me having celiac, is that I really stopped competing like I had. And so that was like the other side of it. But now, like, I mean, now that I've got the classes, I'm like, this is like, my new, like, I haven't tried them all yet because
that's great.
I did get my kind of like, congrats on like, you've gone all these classes. But I think that thinking about how to prioritize and where you spend your time, because it's finite and it's really difficult sometimes to make some of those decisions. But I think I look at my calendar, the beginning of every week, I look at the next, the night before I do all my prep for the next day, and really trying to, even like if I have to work on something, right, like prepare for Shelly's podcast, right? Like I put time, I do put time on my calendar for that. And so
that's great.
I think it goes back to making appointments with yourself. And that's a way also
that's a great tip,
to take that organization to just a whole new level. And I actually had somebody suggest to me, right, if there are people who are important in your life, it's the same thing. Make a date with them, right? And it can be 3 months out, but it's like, and they said it's a date, a time, and a place. So I'm going to meet, Shelly for coffee at a local coffee shop on November 5th at 3 p.m. But this idea, right, that you have it scheduled, because then in your mind, right, you not only do you have something to look forward to, but you have that kind of like touch base with that person, and you're not letting things slide like, oh my, I see you at a conference, I'm like, oh, we should get together. But like literally now, like what I do is yes, that's great, let's say that, but like let's take out our calendars and do it right now. And people look at me like, what are you talking about? Like,
no, it's true though.
My assistant will get in touch with your assistant. I said, let's do it right now, because even if we have to change it, that's okay. But like we have it on our calendar. So those are some of the tips and tricks that, just to kind of manage a lot and I think that you have to ask for help, right? So I think I joined my first board now I was pretty young at the time, almost 8 years ago. And, trying to really understand governance. And, there are a lot of questions I had. I mean, there are questions, boards keep you on your toes, right? There's a lot of questions you still have. But I had to ask people for help in terms of, it's like, Shelly, do you play golf? I feel like you do.
Oh, I loved it. I love golf. Yes.
That's what I was like. I think you play golf.
I
do.
But
like for those of you who play golf, right, there are sometimes there's like written rules and then there's unwritten rules.
Yes.
And, I still remember my first time playing at a work event and like walking through somebody's line. And I love golf as well. I don't know, there's like something very meditative for me, at least. Like everyone loves golf for different reasons. By like the 7th hole, I'm just there like, I'm so happy. I love my life, right? This is so great. Like I'm like, I'm out, right? This is a New Yorker. I'm in nature, right? On the golf course. So not everyone's going to understand that, but it's like, there's a lot of green and trees usually. And so I'm like, that's part of the, and I like, the
That's
social
great.
aspect. And I enjoy it, right? I mean, it's a fun sport, but
Yeah.
it goes back to those kind of like written and unwritten. And I think not being afraid to ask people for help, because you're not being vulnerable. You're in some way showing your strength because you're comfortable asking for help. And I do think, going back to kind of, I think, some of the theme of this podcast, as a woman, sometimes I think I am going to use, and I don't like this word in this sentence, but we're afraid, right? That we're going to show that we're vulnerable. We're going to show that we don't know something. And you know what? We're not, we're not omniscient. We're not omnipotent. We don't know everything. We're not all powerful. Ask, right? Like,
Yeah.
if you don't know, I mean, hey, there are things like I have my team, I'll ask them, I said, I don't know how to do this. Can you record a video? Because I want to be able to, I don't want someone just to tell me. I want to be able, because I want to be the expert, right? I want to be able to go back and watch it again and again and again, so that now it's like in my head and I don't have to go back and ask or go back and read the notes. And I think also too, Shelley, we all have to know what kind of learners we are.
Absolutely. I'm a definite visual learner.
Well, I think that the combination of, like, I think the auditory plus the visual, right? Like, imprints on your mind in a certain way. And some people learn by doing, but I do think that thing with the video that, like, I can go back. And then I'm going to just say, this is my last piece of advice, but I also have and it's a blessing and a curse. I'm going to be very honest. I remember what people say and the exact words they use, and it doesn't really flush from my mind.
Wow.
And so it's good and it's bad, right? If people have ever said anything negative to me, I do remember. And so sometimes, right? And I found myself like, I would avoid people, right? I'm good, and I like constructive feedback. That's the other thing. As women, sometimes we feel like we're being attacked with that. Like, I love it. I like run into it. I like, because I want to be better, right? I want to be better today than I was yesterday. I mean, that's how I think about working out and eating right. And I don't need a lot of sleep. So I understand most people need 6 to 8 hours of sleep. My dad slept 3 to 4. I'm kind of in that camp as well. But I think this idea that we need to ask for help, we need to be comfortable with constructive feedback. And you may want to say to the person, that hurts. Is there another way that you can phrase that? Because I think we also just have to, we need to
That's
be
great,
able
yeah.
to receive that and to be able to, and to ask questions. But if we feel like someone, even if they're not yelling at us, if we feel that they are, right? It's like when somebody uses all caps, which they may just have left the caps lock on, an email, right? But when we feel that, then we may not be receptive. And so I think that there is a lot there in terms of having a mentor that you, and seek ones out. I mean, I've had, I don't know if you'd want me to use his name or not, so I will choose not to.
You can use his name.
Well, I don't know if he's
Oh,
at a public
okay. I gotcha.
he's at a public company.
Okay, no
But
problem.
I'll tell
That's
you,
great.
I sought him out. And okay,
That's great.
This is my last tip, because we're running out of time, I know.
Yes, and you have to answer my last question.
Okay,
That's
so I speak to him that's why we do podcasts at 1:00. I speak to him every Friday at 12.
Oh, great.
None. And having that, going back to put it on your calendar,
Right.
but having that constant touch base every week, and somebody who I am very receptive at, kind of difficult messages, I would say seek somebody out like that in your life who either has done what you want to do, who you're comfortable with, who you are inspired by, etc. But I do think that and that person may not, when you think about what that person might, they're like, kind of LinkedIn profile, it might be, it's probably different than what you think in terms of who actually will have an impact on you.
That's right. So here's my last question, and this is a fun one, and it can be anything. It doesn't have to be related to work. What is your secret power?
That is a good one. I mean, I would say that I am, and it's maybe professionally and personally, I am a super connector. And
Great.
if I were to spend 2 quick minutes on that, it's that I get to really know people. And actually, this does translate into work more than I think. So let me elaborate on that as well. Is I really like to get to know people and what they do. I'm truly interested. I'm like, if I maybe after I retire, I'll become a recruiter because I really like understanding how people got to a certain place. And then, right, when you meet somebody on the other side, you're like, wow, they really have backgrounds that fit really interestingly together. They'd like to get to know each other. I have to say, sometimes my handoffs are not the best because I'm just like, hey, Susie, meet Kyle. I think you guys would enjoy having a conversation. And then I don't. So I like that. I'm doing a better job at that. But at work, right, a lot of what CoreSight does is we help companies, we do a lot of advisory work. And through our advisory work, oftentimes we're introducing them to startups. And one of the things, and then we actually work with a lot of startups, right? We help them with their, kind of, I think their thought leadership and having a voice. So we really get to know both constituencies. And a lot of times when we make introductions to retailers, brands, technology companies of other, of startups, it's because not only is the right fit in terms of a want and a need, but there's also a personality fit and like a cultural fit. And I think that super connector aspect of that, I think that's what fills in kind of the cracks in the cement in terms of how I look at that. But I am an extreme extrovert for anyone who knows me. And so I think that's why, right? Like I will tell you, and I don't know about you, Shelly, during the pandemic, I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm literally, right? Like, first of all, for those of you who know, I was commuting to Hong Kong. Right. So, I mean, that was like what I was doing pre-pandemic and into Shanghai, we had a lab there. So, I mean, I was commuting to Greater China, right? Like, and then all of a sudden it just stopped. Right. And I'm like, okay, I am like spending a lot of time with my family, my guinea pigs, my dogs, right? Like, I'm like, I'm like talking to the guinea pigs at night, put them on the, whole conversation. And, I started to find, so this is like, we'll leave on this note. I knew that I had like kind of crossed to the other side, and I don't know what that was when I was like, I started to look forward to Zooms because I was like, I would get energy from being on a Zoom, and I'm like, it's not. I'm like, I have been locked away for too long, right? But going back to like that energy that you get, and I gotta tell you, going back to, I still remember certain Zoom calls I've had, pandemic and not, where it was just as in 5 minutes, and you're like, I want to spend a lot of time with this person because they just have an energy about them and a wisdom that I know I'll be a better person if I'm like spending time with them just for longer. It can be on Zoom or it can be over a cup of coffee or whatever it might be. But those are the things. And I think that if someone looks at how I spend my time, Shelly, you might say, wow, you could be so much more productive. You could be doing this. But I spend my time with people who I enjoy spending time with. And that I think
That's great.
That's a me thing. And that also may be, as women sometimes, we may not always think about the dollars and cents of it. We may think about like what's sparking joy for us. And for me, it's who I spend time with and the conversations I have. But I'm not always like yes, of course, as a former, as a CPA, right? I know the dollars and cents of how I spend my time. But I don't, right, on my own personal balance sheet, I don't always, kind of spend my time with whom will have the greatest impact on the dollars and cents at CoreSight because it's not consistent with my personal values.
Yep.
And I think we all have to know, right, you have to know yourself well. And okay, one last very quick story on this. Okay. So when I was at Citi, we used to do these non-deal roadshows, which I enjoyed. And we do mall tours. I love doing the mall tours because then you'd work with all the other analysts and you'd have a bus and it was complex but fun. And let's just say chaos with a little bit of structure. And one of my colleagues, we were doing this joint bus tour and she's like, I'm going to tell so-and-so that they can't come because they're at an account that doesn't matter. So, because we each had like 15 clients we could have. And so she told him no. And I call him I said, I got 15 spots. I'd love to have you, right? Like, I love you. So I kid you not, 2 weeks later, he calls me and he's like, that was the best decision you ever made. I was like, well, I said, well, you're somebody I consider a friend. I said, of course, I got to spend time with you as a friend. He's like, no. He's like, I just took a portfolio manager role, and I won't use the name of the company, at one of the largest hedge funds at the time. And he said, and I am going to make sure that we spend time with you. We get to know you,
Oh,
right?
that's
This, that, and the
great.
other. And the whole firm does. And so it goes back to Shelley. If you spend time with people who you enjoy spending time with and you connect with, not always think about the dollars and cents, I always think it kind of works out. It's not karma, it's something else, right? It's just kind of
Yeah.
doing the right thing and it comes back to you.
That's great, Deborah. Deborah, first, I want to thank you so much for being on my podcast. We're so excited. Thank you for sharing your professional and personal journey. So I really appreciate that. And before we leave, is it okay if I tell everyone about your book? So you recently co-authored a book, Next Generation Retail, How to Use New Technology to Innovate for the Future. And my favorite part of the book was talking about how retailers need to fund their own innovation. So congrats on that, and thank you for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Shelley. I can't wait to turn the tables on you and get your life stories. So I'm excited. Thanks for having me on. This is really, it's great to give people the opportunity, I think, to share some of what they've learned along the way. And we all have gotten to where we are through, very different paths. And that, but that collective wisdom, I think, can really help, the next generation. I mean, a lot of stuff that Shelley, I don't know how you kind of codify this, but right, like a lot of the mistakes that we all made or things that we wish we had done different, right? If we can help the next generation, right, get there faster, what a gift that we can give them. And
Absolutely.
thank you for doing this. It really is having an impact.
Thank you.